Dr. Jackson is a New Mexico native and practiced now at the Christus St. Vincent Regional Cancer Center since the year 2017. He graduated summa cum laude from Angelo State University with a Bachelor of Science in Biology. Received a Doctorate of Medicine from University of Texas Health Sciences Center in San Antonio, and then went on to complete a residency program in radiation oncology at the University of Colorado. Dr. Jackson has a full range of specialized clinical experience. He's got numerous publications and has received many awards. When he sent us his curriculum vitae, it was 5 pages long, and I had to just pick a few things out from it. Dr. Jackson lives in Santa Fe now with his wife Amy and children Emma and Elijah. So let's welcome Dr. Matthew Jackson. It was a very informative and I think timely talk about radiotherapy today.
Fantastic, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Matt Jackson. I'm currently a radiation oncology physician at Christus St. Vincent Regional Cancer Center, just down the hill in Santa Fe. See if my remote's going to work here for me. So basically, on the left side of your screen there, that's what most people think I do every day, including my wife. I like to think that what I do every day is more like on the right side of the screen. What's reality? I don't know. Maybe I might be delusional. My patients, however, have an altogether different view of what my life is like. This is kind of who they think I am. I get a lot of remarks about my youth, my young appearance. A lot of patients bring that up. Usually 2 or 3 times a week, a patient will bring that up. I say, gosh, are you sure you're qualified to treat me? You know, I have this cancer, it's trying to kill me. Should I really trust you? I say, I'll look them dead in the eye and say, ma'am, I promise you I'm exquisitely well trained. I've been at the top of my class my entire way. But we're going to have to hurry this up because my mom's picking me up at 3 o'clock. So I'm kind of a small town New Mexico boy. I'm from Artesia, New Mexico. At least that's where I went to middle school and high school, down in the southeast corner of New Mexico. So native of this state. Then I went over to San Antonio for medical school, graduated there in 2012, and then for 5 years after medical school, I was in Denver, Colorado doing my post-medical school training dedicated just to radiation oncology and cancer treatments. So then I moved here, took my first job out of training almost 2.5 years ago now, came to Santa Fe, working for Christus St. Vincent starting in July of 2017 essentially. So tonight, these are some of the things that I'd like to get across. First, I'd hopefully like to relay kind of the mechanism of action behind radiation. So what does it do to a cancer cell? How does it kill the cancer cell and spare the surrounding cells? And then I'd also like, hopefully, to teach you about the different types of radiation treatment and when we might use each one to help combat a disease and cure an illness. Third, I'd like to basically talk about the different types of diseases that we treat. That we're treating a lot of patients with curative intent, but that we have a lot to offer even those patients who we can't cure. We're trying to prolong life, but more importantly than prolonging life is improving and maintaining quality of life. And finally, we'll talk about some of the common side effects of radiation therapy and perhaps dispel some commonly believed myths and misnomers. Although I think probably in Los Alamos, if there's any town across the country that's maybe a little less freaked out, maybe, about radiation, it might be some folks up here so excited to talk about it. So basically, what is radiation therapy? What are we working with? What is our tool? So here I have the electromagnetic spectrum. So coming down on us right now, because we can see each other, is the visible light spectrum. And that runs perfectly in order. We all learned it in grade school. The mnemonic Roy G. Biv, red, orange, yellow, moving across to the left, blue, indigo, violet. So then below violet is ultraviolet, which we cannot perceive, but some animals actually can. And then below ultraviolet light, shorter wavelength, increasing energy, we have X-rays and gamma rays, which are essentially what we use therapeutically to destroy a cancer cell. The difference being X-rays essentially or basically what we use and are generated by a linear accelerator, basically converting an electron through a reaction in that machine into an X-ray. A gamma ray technically comes from the decay of an actual radionuclide. So one of the machines you might have heard about that actually uses a technical gamma ray would be like the Gamma Knife, for example, which has a lump of cobalt-60 actually sitting inside of it. You may have heard a couple of years ago, some guys, I think they were from a drug cartel or something, they broke into this cobalt-60 unit. I think they robbed a truck, and it was carrying a cobalt-60 lump, probably headed for something like a Gamma Knife or something like that. They looked at it, they thought, oh, this is cool. This looks valuable. We're going to steal this, hold it hostage. And I think 3 or 4 days later, they all found them dead out in the desert. So not a good thing to play around with. So some historical context, radiation used to be used for all kinds of crazy, wacky stuff. The image on the left is actually the very first X-ray kind of, just giving credit as the very first X-ray. That's actually Wilhelm Röntgen's wife. And that's her hand there, you can see, and she's wearing her wedding band. And she remarked famously after she saw that her skeleton moving kind of underneath that tube, she said, "I have seen my own death," which is kind of spooky. But then they figured out how to start harnessing X-ray beams and basically pointing them at stuff. And they realized, wow, the body would react in kind of a strange way, and some things would actually disappear. So radiation used to be used for all kinds of things like epitheliomas, acne. The woman in the middle is, I think, getting treated for an epithelioma, which is just kind of a benign mounded growth around the eyelids. It's used all the way up until the 1940s or so for even 50s for acne, thus exposing an entire generation of people to secondary malignancies. So, whoops. And then the one on the right is a guy actually getting treated for tuberculosis, so a mycobacterium infection in the lung with radiation therapy. So we've come a long way from these very crude instruments for reasons that were probably not so good to use radiation in a not so specific way, to have treatment fields that now in the modern era look like this. So we're capable now of harnessing radiation energy and resulting in dose distributions where the high dose is really concentrated right on maybe a pituitary tumor, like you see in this picture, or maybe we can ablate a lung tumor that's super tiny and floating and actually moving with every breath in the lung, and we can accurately target that and get rid of it, especially for a patient who might not be a surgical candidate and otherwise wouldn't be healthy enough to have that tumor eradicated. So how does radiation work? What is it actually doing inside the cell? So this slide talks about that. So there's essentially indirect action and there's direct action. So basically, that incident photon beam, whether it's X-rays or gamma rays, it doesn't matter, but that incident photon beam comes in, and in the top, indirect action, which by the way is about how they estimate, our radiobiologists say about 80% of cancer cells die by indirect action. And that's by actually interacting with a water molecule inside the nucleus of the cell. That forms a free radical, an oxidant, as it were, and that oxidant is then what does the damage to the DNA. So that's about 80% of our work. The other is direct action, and that's where, bam, we don't even need water. Radiation just comes in here, breaks the DNA itself, splits it up. The cancer cell can't repair it. More modern approaches, more of the ablative, super high dose per treatment, so-called stereotactic radiosurgery, stereotactic body radiation therapy, something that I've done a lot of in the program that I started in Santa Fe, tends to actually do a lot more direct action than indirect action, as conventionally fractionated radiation therapy courses had previously done. So why then do we get this kind of effect where we can kill a cancer cell and spare all the tissue on the way in? And the reason there predominantly gets into DNA repair. So it's when there's damage, when you get that little red lightning bolt or explosion in DNA, our normal cells have the ability to easily anneal that break, come in, replace it, lay down new asphalt, new concrete, smooth it over, and that cell's good to go, keep doing its normal function. A cancer cell, by its very definition of how it became cancer in the first place, gave up that right, because it was a cell that basically became corrupt. Its genome got all screwed up, and it had a bad mistake in it. And normally, that same DNA, that same cellular machinery that comes in, lays down new asphalt, smooths things over, and fixes the cell, when it saw that corrupt cancer mistake, would either fix that mistake, or if it couldn't fix that cancerous mistake, it would destroy that cell. But because that cellular machinery is messed up, it's corrupt inside that cancer cell, it can't fix DNA like a normal cell. It allowed that corruption to keep going in perpetuity, kept trying to divide itself and replicate, essentially trying to become immortal. And so it cannot basically heal that damage, it can't repair that damage like a normal cell can. So that's one reason why. The other is essentially dose and accuracy. So if we can put most of these events by far aimed right at the tumor, and the dose is the highest right over the tumor and very low over the normal tissues, well then we also spare those normal tissues, don't ask them to repair as much as the tumor would have to be, and we get that differential response where you can watch a CT scan. A lot of patients I'm doing a CT scan throughout their treatment course with our treatment machines have the ability to image the patient first and then treat. And certain tumor types, you can just watch them melt throughout the entire treatment course, and they're essentially gone by the time the patient finishes. So there's essentially three main types. There's three big categories of radiation therapy. These are kind of your big baskets, as it were. Most of what we're going to talk about tonight is external beam radiation, because that's probably about 90 to 95% of patients globally that are treated with therapeutic radiation. But there are the other two main types are brachytherapy. Brachy just meaning Greek for short. So it's short therapy, meaning it's usually an implanted device with radioactivity that comes from within the device, treating that patient from the inside out. It's a super conformal, very, very accurate way to treat a patient because of the physics of how radiation moves through tissue. That dose is essentially proportional to the distance you are from it, but then squared. So if you can move even just millimeters away from the source, you're really cutting that dose by an incredible amount. So brachytherapy is a fantastic way to treat cancer. We do a lot of that for endometrial cancer at our center. We do a lot of that for breast cancer at our center. One very popular way to use brachytherapy is for prostate cancer. You might have heard or have relatives, or some of you in this room actually yourselves may have had a seed implant where radioactive iridium seeds are actually deposited into the prostate gland. It's a fantastic way to treat cancer, but not something we're going to spend a ton of time on tonight. And then the third basket, as it were, will be unsealed sources. And so these are essentially chemicals or radiopharmaceuticals that hold on to a certain radioactive property, go where we want them, and destroy cancer that way. So a couple of examples at my institution where we use this frequently. One is what's pictured, and so that's a drug called Xofigo. I just prefer to call it by its real name, its generic name as it were, which is radium-223. So it's a little radioactive nanoparticle that essentially your body thinks is calcium. And it's indicated for patients with metastatic prostate cancer, whose prostate cancer is spread throughout their body, and they have those spots in their bones actually hurt and ache. And this is one effective therapy for them to prolong survival and improve quality of life. And so essentially when I give this to one of my patients, their body thinks it's calcium, sends it in like a Trojan horse to places where their body needs calcium. And where would that be in a guy with bone metastases? Well, it's into the bone metastases. His body is crying out for more calcium, saying, hey, we have damage here, we have disruption, we have something irritating the bones in all these spots, send in more calcium, bring it in, buy the truckload, let's lay it down. So we send it in the form of radium-223, and it sends it in right inside, right next to and even into the cancer cell, killing the cancer cell that way. And so it's a nice way, again, to treat the cancer and spare the patient's normal tissues. The reason being, the radioactivity, because of the emission of radium-223, you can essentially block all the radiation in radium-223 with a sheet of notebook paper. So it doesn't work at all unless you get it right inside at a cellular level, immediately adjacent to the cancer cell. Otherwise, it's just excreted in the patient's urine or stool. But let's talk a little bit more about external beam radiation treatment. So this is the primary machine that we use, as it were, to administer therapeutic radiation to patients. It's called a linear accelerator, or in kind of our slang term, we call it a LINAC. And my physicists know a lot more about the inner workings of this machine than I do, but to give you kind of the rudimentary rundown, essentially what you're looking at is the place where the patient lays, and we call it a couch. And ours are made of kind of state-of-the-art carbon fiber. And the reason we make our tabletops out of carbon fiber is it's incredibly, incredibly rigid. It's stiff. It doesn't flex. It doesn't sag, even if a big person lays on it. And in radiation therapy, millimeters matter. So if I told you, hey, I want you to come in, I want you to lay on top of that piano in the exact same way every single time for, let's say, 35 treatments. It sounds simple enough, you could get roughly close, but getting precisely close within a millimeter is actually exceptionally, exceptionally difficult. So we need everything as stiff, as rigid, as reproducible, and as accurate as possible. So we have lasers that kind of come out of the ceiling, come out of the walls. They're not powerful lasers, they're actually no more powerful than this laser pointer here, but they're grid systems. They're basically leveling marks. And so we're making sure the patient is straight up and down, patient is straight side to side with those lasers inside the room. They lay on that couch, on that carbon fiber tabletop, and that couch is actually robotic. So it has the ability to make little micro adjustments in terms of millimeters, up, down, in, out, and left, right. So we have X, Y, Z adjustments to be able to bring that patient back into perfect, precise position. An example might be prostate cancer. So we might have a prostate cancer patient lay down on that couch, we line him up perfectly with the laser leveling system, and then that machine right there does a scan, and we see, okay, we're close, but unbeknownst to us, based on external anatomy, everything looked perfect. But he went to Denny's, had the Grand Slam breakfast the day before, now he's got a big gas bubble right behind the prostate. But hasn't quite made its way out yet, so it's ours to deal with now. And that gas bubble is enough a lot of times just to push on the prostate a little bit. Just a couple of millimeters, it might knock it forward to the left a little bit, because that gas bubble takes up room. So with this tabletop, we can basically bring him back into perfect position. So how the beam is generated, back here in the head of the machine, there's a little electron gun. Usually there's a tungsten filament, and it heats up, and it pops off electrons, basically, when you get it hot. And so here come the electrons popping off, and this accelerating waveguide basically makes a current, forces those electrons down this tube called the waveguide. And so those electrons are screaming by the time they get down here to the end. And then there's a bending magnet, because it's actually, we can't bring the beam straight out this way. We need it to go towards the patient, towards the tumor. So it bends, there's a magnet that bends at 270 degrees, makes kind of a little Hot Wheels track loop, and then boom, hits this thing called a target, usually a lump of tungsten. Undergoes a reaction called Brachytherapy, which is just German for breaking radiation. And those electrons then hit that tungsten target, photons, X-rays are generated and head in right here to the tumor. That's our isocenter, and that's what our machine is rotating around. It rotates 360 degrees around the patient. So we use 2 particles in Santa Fe, and there's a third one that we'll talk about later in more detail. But essentially, therapeutic radiation in the modern era is electrons, it's photons, or it's protons. You might have heard there used to be a neutrons. Neutrons kind of ran out of favor. They didn't work so well. They had kind of a last holdout treating salivary gland cancers. There's still a couple centers that use them, but for the most part, people don't use neutrons. Mostly because it's really hard to shield for neutrons. You need, we already need, a foot or more of like concrete, shielding, all this incredibly sophisticated engineering to shield our neutrons is like, way in excess of that. So they're tough to shield for. So we're using either electrons or photons at our center. That's probably 99% of radiation centers around the world are using those 2 particles. So when might we use one or the other? Well, electrons, let me explain this graph real quick for a second. So on our axis over here, on our y-axis, is basically the percent of dose from that beam. All right, so the percent strength. Think of it, the strength of that energy. The x-axis is basically your depth into tissue. So your depth in from the surface of the skin down into tissue. So you can see that electrons have a higher dose right at the surface, but then they quickly give up that dose advantage and they fall off quickly. And by just a little bit into tissue, they're essentially gone. There's no more energy left at all. So the one thing that's really good for is skin cancer. That's something we see a lot of. up in northern New Mexico at 7,000 feet with a lot of people who love being outside. So electrons come into play a lot, mostly for skin cancer. They're not good for a whole lot else. Anything that's deeper below the skin, or certainly more than a few centimeters, is something where you're going to want to switch to photon. So this is what does most of the walking for us. Photon, it starts a little bit lower actually than electron. It takes a few centimeters to reach its full strength, and then it's going to dive down and fade off. But we can actually, using multiple different photon beams from multiple different angles, arrive at a place where we're making a super tight, really conformal target right around our tumor. And we'll talk about protons more here in a little bit. So radiation, we use it to cure a lot of cancers. And these are all cancers that we treat right in Santa Fe, so just right down the road. And the ones I've bolded are all tumors where we're actually using radiation as the only or the primary curative treatment for that patient, meaning no surgery. Radiation is just relied upon to totally and completely melt and get rid of that tumor, and it doesn't come back. So what about side effects of radiation therapy? So predominantly the one thing I want you to remember is, outside of some fatigue, right? So fatigue is a side effect of anything in medicine. Whether you start a new blood pressure medication, you prescribe a new exercise regimen, chemotherapy, surgery, fatigue is always a side effect, and radiation therapy is no different. Although my patients who exercise during treatment actually have far less fatigue, funny enough, than my patients who are couch potatoes. So if you know any friends or family members who end up undergoing radiation therapy, tell them to exercise during their treatment. There's actually good scientific literature, it's published data that says they'll do better if they're exercising in just a light to moderate way. They don't have to train for a marathon, they don't have to set a new personal best, but just a little bit of even just walking, stationary bike riding does a world of good. But outside of that fatigue, all other side effects are local. Radiation in the modern era is extremely precise, and it works and causes side effects right where we point it. So, meaning if I'm treating a woman for breast cancer, she will not lose her hair, she will not get nauseous, but she will get a pink sunburned breast, and she'll experience some fatigue. Those are the two main side effects with breast cancer radiation. However, there are short-term side effects versus long-term side effects. So in the short term, those are the side effects that while the patient's there with me getting treatment, maybe for a few weeks, those side effects start from nothing. They're related to the dose that I give during treatment. First 2 weeks, it's like a honeymoon period. There's no side effects. The patient often wonders if we're giving them some kind of placebo treatment, because they come in, they lay down. My therapist tells them, okay, we'll be right back. We'll come and get you in 2 minutes. They lay there. This machine clicks and whirs, but they don't see anything coming out of the machine. They don't feel anything coming out of the machine. There's no frying, sizzling, popping. There's no smell of bacon frying at any point. And then my staff comes back in the room, helps them off the table, they go on about their business, and they go back to work full time, or they go to the gym, or they go pick their kids up from school, and they head home. Well, after a couple of weeks, usually that's when you start to see local side effects from short-term treatment. And those will reach their peak at the end of the patient's radiation treatment course, hang out for a week or two, and then they'll fade completely and go back to the patient's baseline. So these are things like for breast cancer, skin redness, sunburn. Occasionally the skin will blister or peel, especially the fold underneath the breast or the curve of the armpit. For prostate cancer, this might be a little bit, because the prostate's right below the bladder where the urine's trying to get out, might be a little bit of tingling or burning when a man urinates, might be a little bit of loose stool or urgency to go have a bowel movement. And then that's going to kind of fade after treatment's over. But then long term, there's things you have to watch out for with radiation. The reason is radiation can kind of activate cells called fibroblasts in the body that basically cause tissue to tighten up. The fancy word for it's fibrosis. Kind of a lay term for it might be, you could think of it as kind of usually a gentle but subtle scar tissue reaction that can set in. Such that, for example, a breast cancer woman after being treated for breast cancer, being treated with radiation, 5 years later, may very much like the symmetry of having her breast conserved, not having to have had a mastectomy. But she also might notice, if she's really paying attention when she steps out of the shower, she might notice that her treated breast maybe rides a little bit higher on her chest, is maybe a touch more tan than the side that wasn't treated. and that kind of thing. So there are long-term side effects that I always advise my patients of and consent them to before we get started. And then the last part is the side effects are proportional to the dose that I deliver and the volume that's treated. So a big swath, big giant tumor in the pelvis, for example, where we're treating through a lot of tissue, a big area to get at this entire nasty tumor, it's going to have more side effects related to it than maybe a guy who just has cancer in a normal sized prostate, where we can be super precise and super focused, treating just a little golf ball size organ. And likewise, dose matters too. So some of my patients, like my lymphoma patients, lymphoma is a disease that just melts. I mean, you could just almost watch it day by day shrink and go away when you treat it with the radiation beam. Those patients, we don't need that much dose. A lot of times that patient's treatment course is over in as few as 2 weeks with curative intent, whereas sometimes certain treatments like sarcoma, for example, requires an awful lot of dose. And that patient, you might notice by the end of treatment, has a lot more skin redness and irritation, maybe peely skin on top, like a real bad sunburn, compared to that lymphoma patient who kind of skated through without anything at all. That's because it's related to total dosage you're depositing in tissue. Okay. So just to walk you through in kind of our techniques, we'll start with kind of old ways that weren't really done anymore, and that's this. So I actually wasn't even trained on this technique. This fell out of favor right before I started residency. Kind of stopped doing this altogether. But this is how for decades and decades, basically from like the 50s or 60s through certainly the late 80s into the 90s, this was the mainstay of radiation therapy. And so this is treating a head and neck cancer. What you're seeing here is kind of a sideways x-ray, almost like the x-ray beams looking this way through the side of someone's face, treating head and neck cancer. And how radiation therapy used to be delivered is you get on a simulator, which is essentially just a plain film x-ray machine, but that's shaped kind of like a linear accelerator. It has the couch, and instead of the head of the machine, has basically a thing that takes x-rays. So the radiation oncologist would decide, okay, we're going to use this beam angle, and this beam angle, maybe this beam angle. So give me 3 x-rays from those angles. Then they would print out those x-rays. The radiation oncologist would go to those x-rays with a grease pencil. I'm not even kidding. They take a little colored pencil, and they draw those things you can see there. They draw the lines, and those are blocks. So right there, I don't know if you guys can see that, but essentially there's hash marks through there. So they're saying, block this. The spinal cord runs back there. We need to block that. We don't need to treat the face, so block that. But all this indiscriminately, yeah, we're going to treat that with radiation. Let's treat that. So it was, it worked because the body's a remarkable organism. It can heal tissue incredibly well, but it's a toxic treatment. And we couldn't go as high. We had to stop sooner because of side effects. So that fell out of favor and led to the big revolution was planning based upon CT scans. So a CT scan, or a CAT scan, computed tomography, basically gives you a 3D rendering of the body that you can scroll through in multiple ways, and you can scroll up and down. Essentially gives you hundreds of x-rays of the body, moving through, almost picture slicing a person like a loaf of Wonder Bread, and you can flip through each piece of bread and look at it and gain important information from it. So we use that, and the nice thing about CT scan is it's captured with x-rays. So meaning that the attenuation, or how things look on a CT, it's going to affect a radiation beam the same way. So the white stuff on here, the ribs that we're looking at, we know they're more dense. They're going to attenuate, or they're going to weaken a radiation beam more. Lungs are just air. They're not going to hardly attenuate a radiation beam at all. So it allowed us to start using multiple beams in kind of an organized way. This patient looks like 4 beams, so 3 from the back and 1 from the front. And what these colored lines are, you'll see them in the future slides as well. It's essentially dose. So the cooler colors usually, these pinks, these purples, are lower doses of radiation that are unlikely to cause too many side effects. And as we get hotter, we see these warmer, brighter colors, the green, then the reds, the oranges, that lead to higher doses. We're treating essentially a cancer right here in this vertebral body. Then, in widespread use, starting probably around 2000 to 2004 was the beginning of what's called the IMRT era. So IMRT is intensity modulated radiation therapy, and the first iteration of this was with static fields, or beams that stayed still. So the machine would come to a certain point, stop and treat, but it's still incredibly sophisticated. and you can get super accurate, very, very tight, essentially dose depositions of tissue. So the two things that make IMRT basically kind of fancy and a lot better. The first is that it's basically non-uniform fluid. So what do I mean by that? Well, I mean from different angles, you can pump in more or less dose depending upon how favorable your geometry is. So, for example, maybe you're treating, let's use prostate cancer. I'm using prostate cancer and breast cancer a lot because those are the two most common cancers, one in my department, but also kind of across the globe outside of skin cancer. Breast cancer is the most common in women, prostate cancer is the most common cancer in men, and so you or your friends or relatives are most likely to have kind of wrap your brains, I think, probably around one of those two. So maybe you have a favorable angle that can kind of sneak in from one side and avoid a sensitive organ. For prostate cancer, maybe the rectum or the bladder. So we might like that angle, so we increase the fluence or increase the energy that's coming in from that angle. Whereas another angle, like, yeah, it's decent, we can bring in some dose from there, but maybe not the best. So let's do a little bit less dose from there. And that helps us be really super accurate, really super conformal. The next thing that, honestly, the one that made it really pretty sweet is the fact that it's inverse plane. So what does that mean? Well, the older types of radiation treatment, certainly 2D, but even 3D, starts with some really smart people that are trained, not just a physician, but I'm talking about our dosimeters who basically design radiation plans for a living. But they basically tell the computer, okay, here's where I want the beam, this is how much dose comes from this beam, here, and this is the coverage that we get. So basically you're starting from scratch, and you're building something in a very straightforward way. With IMRT, you're using super sophisticated computer algorithms, and you essentially tell the computer, you say, okay, computer, I want to cover, let's say, 98% of this tumor with 98% of X dose that I've specified. But at the same time, you have to figure out a way to do that and keep the dose to the bladder at this very low dose to this very low volume. Oh, and the rectum, keep that low too, to this very low dose and this very low volume. Oh, same thing for the femoral heads, and the penile bulb, and the small bowel, and the large bowel. So it starts getting really complicated, but the computer can handle it. Over hours, how it used to take hours. Dosimetrists would have to set this up, and the computer would have to be super powerful. Computers would have to churn at it overnight. Essentially, think of it as if running thousands of radiation plans to find out which one was the best. Nowadays, it takes us only, probably 10 or 15 minutes sometimes to design an IMRT plan with how powerful computers have gotten. And that's pretty cool. The next iteration of IMRT was essentially arc-based therapy. Some people call VMAT, or volumetric modulated arc therapy. It's essentially the same thing as IMRT. It's still inverse planned, and there's still non-uniform fluence. But essentially now we use a continuous sweep of beam from essentially almost 360 degrees around the patient. So this picture here, these are all CT scans. So our perspective here is as though we're looking up through the feet of someone. Picture a man's feet coming out of the screen at you, toes facing up towards the ceiling. So his feet are sticking out of that screen. You're looking up through the soles of his feet, again sliced like a loaf of bread, and we're moving up slice by slice. And this is a slice through the pelvis and through the prostate. So prostate is here, rectum is back here, femoral heads are here, and then here is, these circles basically indicate the path of the arc. So usually we'll do an arc here, come around, and then that machine will rotate, give us some different geometry, and come back that way, and treat a prostate. So that's kind of how VMAT works. So we'll see, I do have a couple of videos, we'll see if they work. So this video is essentially giving you a sense of what's going on inside the treatment machine during an arc, during VMAT. So those little blue rectangles are something that is essentially called MLCs, or multi-leaf collimation. So those little tiny things, they're about 5 millimeters wide, they're made of tungsten, and they can come in and out. So what you're seeing, that's the beam's eye view, that's what the radiation beam sees as it's trying to exit the machine. And as that beam is sweeping around the patient, we can essentially make any shape we want with those MLCs. So you can see how sometimes it almost totally closes off, and other times it almost seems wide open. So when it's wide open, that's a really favorable angle, and if you're watching that patient getting treated, that machine might stay there and stick there for a few seconds, might almost seem to lag, and then during some of those other phases where everything's kind of closed down, well, then you might see the machine move a little bit faster because it didn't really like that angle. So here's a rendering of a patient's treatment plan that I designed last week, and this is head and neck cancer. Let's see if we can get it to play here. There we go. So that's the patient's own skeleton that's generated in our treatment planning software. And you can see in green and blue are the nodal bases that are basically harboring cancer that we have to treat. But then beside it, there's the light blue in the center of the esophagus. There's salivary glands like the submandibular salivary gland. There's the parotid glands. There's the spinal cord. And we can essentially twist and move that patient's body in 3D space after they've left our department. They're gone. They're at home while we're designing their radiation treatment plan. And you get something that kind of looks like this. Oh, might have frozen up actually back there. I don't know if you can click maybe back and then try to click back into that video one time.
Okay. This one?
Yeah, can we go back a slide maybe?
Huh.
It's all frozen.
Yeah, it shows up here, but not down there. You want me to restart PowerPoint?
Yeah, that'd be good.
Okay. Where's it broadcasting?
Is it back up?
Yeah, it's on my screen. So when I restart it, it should automatically.
Yeah, it should.
Right? Ah,
There we go.
I didn't know I had to put that. Okay.
Okay, we'll skip that video. So an important concept in radiation is fractionation, which basically means how many radiation treatments do you get to cure a particular disease. So fraction is just an individual treatment session. Gray is our unit of measurement, so named after a famous guy in our field. And standard fractionation is one of these two things. That's how things have been done for a long time. So you get 2 gray per fraction or 1.8 gray per fraction. And you give that a bunch of times and it adds up to a high dose that kills the cancer, cures the tumor, and allows the normal tissue kind of overnight in between fractions to repair and regenerate so that again we can cure a cancer without making the patient too sick. So these are 2 commonly utilized courses, for example, for prostate cancer that have been used for decades with great success. But we're finding ways to maybe do things a little bit better. But just to convince you that basically more fractions to a point is better, here's a few slides that kind of illustrate that point. So on the right in these tables are basically trials that looked at dose escalation or more fractions or more dose of prostate cancer. So as our techniques improve, which I've just shown you, going from 2D to 3D, to IMRT, static field, to VMAT, we're getting more and more conformal, more and more tight on our target. Doesn't it make sense then that we should be able to safely deliver more dose, be a little more aggressive against that cancer, while simultaneously causing less side effects? Turns out we can. And so these 5 clinical trials, all very well done, you can see all very well powered, had a ton of hundreds and hundreds of patients, basically told us every single time, yeah, when you increase the dose you deliver to prostate cancer, give a little bit more, your cure rate's a little bit higher. So in these graphs over here on the left side, 78 gray of radiation, which is one of those regimens I showed you on the previous slide, the top, so 39 treatments, versus just 35 treatments. So look at the difference that 4 treatments makes in our ability to give that safely. So you're basically putting patients on that blue line instead of the red line. So more treatments seemed like it was better, but God, that's a long time. 39 treatments, holy cow. I mean, that's 8 weeks. It's a long time to come in and out every day. And granted, everyday radiation treatment's very short, 5 minutes or less during a 15-minute appointment time. Most of my patients are bebopping in and out of the department, roughly half an hour door to door usually. But some really smart people were thought, okay, well that's good, but what about with our new technology? You know, we always thought we had to go really slow in these tiny little chunks, these 1.8 or 2 gray fractions, to allow the normal tissues time to recover. But couldn't you really go a little bit faster than that? What happens if we turn the juice up, maybe give 2.5 or 3 gray of radiation per treatment? And basically what they found in these 4 trials is that absolutely, yes, for certain well-selected patients with prostate cancer, you can absolutely go quicker, and things turn out just fine. So you can see in these, they're comparing fractionation regimens like 41 treatments to 28 treatments. Here they're comparing 37, 20, and 19, 39 versus 20, 39 versus 19. And basically what you're seeing in efficacy, all of these numbers in kind of our scientific parlance, if they cross 1, if that range crosses 1, there's really no difference that we can detect. You can tell we're not detecting any superiorities in any of those comparisons. And the toxicity is actually really favorable. It turned out, didn't really make guys much more sick. It really didn't make them any more sick. It tolerated just fine. When you put all this data together in something called a meta-analysis, it looks like maybe when you go a little quicker for prostate cancer, you might be just a bit likely to cause a little bit more loose stool or diarrhea by the end of treatment. It fades back to the baseline and is indistinguishable to patients or their doctors months, a couple months out from treatment. So short-term loose stool was really the only difference. It was maybe a little bit worse, possibly, when you go a little bit quicker. So what about breast cancer? What about the flip side? So I'll take the same approach here, and I'll convince you first, radiation is important, it works, and it does something that's worth doing. So these figures are a little bit small, but essentially what we're comparing on the top line generally, this is a big meta-analysis that was done a few years ago, and this is comparing breast-conserving surgery alone. So say a woman has a breast cancer. She has a breast cancer, it's small, she gets it excised, she doesn't want to remove the whole breast, but instead of a mastectomy, it should be a bigger surgery, longer recovery, more disfiguring. She just wants the tumor removed with a ring of normal tissue. So this is comparing women who did that versus women who did that exact same surgery, but did do a course of radiation treatment afterwards. So you can see when looking at any first recurrence, death for breast cancer, any first recurrence anywhere in the body, or breast cancer death, basically, if you add radiation after the smaller surgery, you're putting women down, way down here on these lower lines of cancer, much less likely to recur after the smaller surgery, after the lumpectomy, if you're adding radiation. So it's a standard of care now with the lumpectomy as something called BCT, or breast conservation therapy. But what about after a mastectomy? There's still a role for radiation. We're still helping patients, especially if they had their lymph nodes involved. So if the cancer had spread from the breast to the lymph node, maybe she's opted for a mastectomy, or maybe the tumor's just large enough she needed to have a mastectomy. Or radiation still helping. So we're decreasing the rate of local recurrence, way down to here. We're decreasing any first recurrence, and we're decreasing breast cancer mortality in a meaningful way by adding radiation therapy to sterilize any cancer that may be left in that area when the lymph nodes are involved after mastectomy. What about after a sentinel node? So a sentinel node is a more modern procedure. So used to, a woman had breast cancer, it was in her lymph nodes up in her armpit, and she had to get all those lymph nodes removed, at least 10 of them, just a bunch, just pluck them out of there. But that's a tough surgery, and it's an extra scar, there's more wound healing problems, especially there's more range of motion difficulty after you've had someone mucking around with sharp objects in your armpit. There's more arm swelling or lymphedema afterwards if you do a full lymph node dissection. So the surgeons, a while ago, they thought, well, maybe we could just sample the first lymph node. And how do we find it? Well, there's a little radioactive dye you can inject in the breast, and there's also a blue dye you can inject in the breast. Most surgeons actually use both of those, and they'll then make a tiny little slit up in the armpit. They'll find the blue lymph node that took up the blue dye, and they'll put this little white, almost like a little detector on it, and it clicks. And it basically took up that little, it's called a radiocolloid. And that's basically the first lymph node in the chain. So that's represented by this little orange thing that comes from the red tumor. So this was a trial trial that was done basically saying, all right, sentinel node's positive, so a woman has node-positive breast cancer now. Do we really need to do a full dissection? Do we now need to do what's been standard for decades, remove all those lymph nodes, or could we just do radiation in that area? Well, it turns out it actually doesn't matter in terms of disease recurrence or survival. So red line are women who had a node dissection. Blue line's women who just stopped there and had axillary radiation. There's no difference statistically in disease-free survival or overall survival. However, what they found is women who got the radiation to their armpit and their lymph nodes had much less side effects, less toxicity after treatment was over, especially lymphedema. Lymphedema rates were half. But then in breast cancer, we'll say, can we treat more quickly? And the answer again, yes, absolutely. So going from 25 down to 16, this was a Canadian study. We're seeing no differences in recurrence or survival. Same thing in the United Kingdom. We're basically seeing no difference. And I know those lines look a little separate. This is risk of local regional relapse, so it actually makes it look, when you first look at it, like the shorter course. Actually, 15 treatments is not only shorter, but it actually is less recurrences. Turns out that's not actually statistically valid. We consider those two to be the same. But importantly, again, we're seeing something even better than in prostate cancer and breast cancer. When we go shorter, there's actually less side effects, not just equivalent, but actually fewer. So we're getting the same, we're doing just as good a job against the cancer, where we're causing less breast kind of swelling and edema and things like that. So that's nice, we've gone from 25 to 15, but in the modern era, sophisticated as things have gotten, how few treatments could we really use? So that gets at a concept that the programs we're just starting in Santa Fe, essentially called stereotactic radiation. Stereotactic just meaning external frame of reference, meaning we're going very tight, super conformal, basically to tumors that are very isolated in space and just kind of solitary. So you can do radiosurgery for brain mets, you can do stereotactic body radiation therapy. The Canadians, I think, have a better name for it. They call it SABRE, which is stereotactic ablative radiation. I like SABRE because it just makes me feel cool. And generally this is defined as only a maximum of 5 treatments. I think in Canada they can use like up to 7 or something like that and call it SABRE. And high doses. So instead of just like 2.5 or 3, they're a minimum of 5 gray per fraction. But even that's kind of weak sauce for SBRT. Usually SBRT, you're talking at least 10 gray per fraction, around 15. In some places, big experienced centers, they're even getting 40 gray in one single walloping fraction. So this is synonymous with a couple of machines a lot of you probably heard about. They're just exquisitely well marketed, but basically the knife machines, they're basically just brand names. There's like Ford, Chevy, they have a Gamma knife, a Cyber knife, basically machines that are just good at delivering this type of technique. But a modern linear accelerator, an experienced clinic with an experienced radiation oncologist and a good medical physicist can also deliver stereotactic radiation just fine in a super effective way. Again, getting to these super tight, this is where we get those very, very tight, very, very accurate, very hot treatment fields that I showed you earlier. So let's say you or a loved one comes in to your primary care office, been smoking your whole life, it's a big no-no, you know you shouldn't have done it, but you're motivated, you quit last year, but you have this cough. And your primary care physician orders that. You see this little nodule. What's the best way to treat that? Well, traditionally, and still, the standard of care is absolutely surgery for the operable patient. But think about a lot of patients who get lung cancer. A lot of them are older, maybe they're not as functional, maybe they have bad lungs already because they've been smoking for a long time. So basically people started using this kind of therapy to treat those, and they realized, you know what, this radiation thing, this stereotactic radiation, this SABRE is really good. We're seeing really good control rates that are on par and equivalent to surgery. Maybe we should test these two in a randomized control trial. So the long-standing standard, which again, I'm here to tell you still in 2019, the standard of care for the operable patient is surgery. There's some interesting data that suggests that maybe that's not always going to be the case. So this is a study, essentially pooled 2 randomized control trials. This is really hard to see, so I won't force you to read the screen, but essentially 2 different groups tried to do this, one in the United States and one in Europe. They said, we're going to randomize patients. Half get surgery, half get SABRE. Let's see what happens. Well, if you really think about it, that's a really tough trial to fill up with patients and get a lot of patients to sign up for. Because think about it, put yourself in that patient's shoes. If you had a little lung cancer nodule floating in your lung, would you ever let someone say, okay, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to sign you up, sign right here on the dotted line, and I'm going to flip a coin. If it's heads, you have to go to the OR for surgery. If it's tails, you have to go to the radiation department, get stereotactic radiation. No, most people aren't that nice. They're not that, giving to the scientific literature. They want to think about it, they want to talk about it with their family, with their spouse, with their doctors, and then make their own decision, which I think I would probably be in the same boat. But, essentially, the group in the United States got a few tables. They got a few people to sign up for it. To say, you know what, sure, go ahead, both sound reasonable, both sound good, sign me up. I'll follow the randomization. And people in Europe did the same thing. But neither trial could really fill it up with enough patients to really get a high level of confidence in the statistics. Because when you're doing statistics on a clinical trial, you need a certain amount of numbers so you can feel real confident. But these two folks got together. Radiation therapy is a very small field. These people got together and said, hey, we tried this study and it failed. Folks in Europe said, you know what, we tried almost the same exact study, it failed too. And so, well, what if we combine our data? We might get enough people in a combined fashion to reach a valid conclusion. So they did that, and this is what they found. The results were published a few years ago called STARS Result. So blue line is essentially stereotactic radiation, or SABR. Red line, surgery. So this is recurrence-free survival. And so what you're seeing is these really are pretty much the same. Those lines are running together in terms of how frequently the cancer comes back. This is survival without lung cancer, is basically what that's graphing out. So, okay, that's following so far what we thought we knew, Actually, this was a little bit surprising. It's like, well, we knew radiation was good, we didn't think it was as good as surgery. We thought it'd be a little bit more recurrences in the radiation arm, but we thought it would hang tight. Turns out it hung real tight. Those curves are essentially overlapping. You can look at that p-value. P-values, if they're significant, are supposed to be less than 0.05, so this is nowhere close. So that's pretty much the same. What was surprising was this, and this is overall survival. So this is just whether that patient's alive or are they dead. And you can see here, based upon this study at least, which is super controversial, basically set the stereotactic radiation and the thoracic surgery world on fire and was published. All radiation, stereotactic radiation people were like, look at this. And all the surgeons were like, here's what's wrong with your trial. This, and this. This is total BS. I don't buy it. So, essentially, you have this early drop in the surgery arm. And what some of the smarter people in my field are kind of positing is calling it this head start effect. Where basically, cancer's not coming back too much in either one because, the treatments, both treatments do a pretty good job of controlling cancer. But a lobectomy, to have someone go in and take out a chunk of your lung, at any age is a pretty big procedure, especially when you're elderly and maybe you're a former smoker. And there's a certain amount of post-operative mortality associated with surgery. So maybe it's that you get this post-operative mortality from surgery. Surgery hurts a few folks, they don't do as well. And then the people that do survive out past that period tend to track and do just as well. But it's just that it got so low, those lines never basically caught up with each other. So that was a big trial in my field. It was hypothesis generating, I think, because you're not really supposed to combine two different randomized controlled trials to get your own. That's, it's kind of cheating in a way, I guess the surgeons would say. And these are all really small numbers. Remember those prostate cancer and breast cancer studies I showed you earlier? Had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of patients. I mean, this one we started with 31 in the radiation arm, and we started with 27 in the surgery arm. So that's, what we need now. Now is the time, basically, to fill up a study like this and do it right, fill it completely, and figure out, is this real or not? A couple of other cool things just to close. I'm reaching the end of my time. Today we've started doing 4D CTs now to basically plan treatment for lung cancer. So instead of those static CT images I showed you, we can now basically take moving pictures and take a movie of a tumor floating in a lung so I can adjust for that during treatment. That's pretty slick. The other thing we're doing for breast cancer is basically treating women while they're holding their breath. You're thinking, that sounds crazy, why would you do that? Well, it's only for women with left-sided breast cancer because I'm very worried about their heart. The heart's a left-leaning organ, a lot of times sits right underneath the left breast. But if a woman takes a big deep breath in, a lot of times that puts a nice fat pillow of air right between her breast in between her heart, and it also anatomically squeezes and shoves that heart further down in the thorax. And hopefully I've kind of convinced you in radiotherapy, especially in the modern era, millimeters is really miles. So if we can get a couple of centimeters of distance between the heart, extra centimeters between the heart and the breast, we're really doing some really cool things for that patient. So you can see this exemplified here again, same view of a CT scan. This woman's feet are sticking out at us. We see two pictures of her. In the left side, she's just free breathing, and we scanned her, and we're going to plan breast radiation, and the back edge of the radiation beam is something like that red line. And then on the other side, she takes a nice big full deep breath in. See that big pillow of air basically that gets wedged in between her heart and her breast. Her heart is not getting any dose at all, which is really nice. So what about protons? Kind of to finish, a lot of people ask me about that. So that was that other curve there. So you can see they kind of come in, you get this thing called a Bragg peak. Man, that looks awesome, doesn't it? You just low dose coming in, spikes, delivers all its energy, and then like no dose coming out. Oh, that sounds great. And then you can basically treat a tumor by doing a lot of those little Bragg peaks. And you can mount them. You can basically add them up and put a bunch of them in, and you get this thing that looks like this. So here, black line is how photons move through tissue. Red line is how protons theoretically are being deposited in tissue. You get this thing called a spread out Bragg peak, or SOBP. So a super exciting therapy that I'm excited about. I think, has a potential. Maybe we can harness this and figure out how to be even more precise and even more accurate. But we'll talk about, the data. Just not quite there yet, at least for prostate cancer. So this is a typical dose distribution you might see with protons. With X-rays, you're getting more of this low dose. It's not hot, it's not high dose, it's lower dose, but it's kind of outside of that high dose region. But certainly if you could pick one, at least theoretically modeled in space, gosh, that looks pretty attractive. Turns out maybe some of this lower dose actually doesn't matter, doesn't affect those cells enough to cause any side effects, either short-term or long-term. Here's prostate. So protons down generally are usually, they're starting to figure out ways to do IMRT with protons, but still generally we're treating with two beams. But that's really all that the proton physicists think you really need, because if you can get that Bragg peak right over the prostate, you're really doing some good. Of course, photons is an IMRT plan for prostate. We're getting some of this low dose kind of spread out over the place. But there's some data on this. So this has been compared because basically, everyone's excited about sending, like a 14-year-old girl gets a tiny tumor back against her brainstem between her eyes. Sure, whether there's data or not, we're sending her where theoretically we can get the best treatment possible. But with prostate, there's a lot of prostate cancer out there. It's the most common cancer in men. And in order to keep those places open, to be there for the young kids and stuff that need it, and to keep those centers profitable and open, they also need to be treating some prostate cancer. And there's a lot of prostate cancer out there. And so people have looked at, are protons really better for prostate cancer? What's the data? So these are 4 studies that I pulled from our National Cancer Care Guidelines, or our NCCN guidelines, basically our kind of rule book that oncologists should be looking at, kind of playing by. So they talk about this prospective, one from 2014, said basically there was really no difference between the two treatments. This matched Medicare cohort said that basically protons looked like they had less genitourinary side effects at 6 months. So maybe like less burning or tingling with urination. It's a little easier to start a stream, more complete emptying of the bladder for that guy. 6 months out from treatment, but the difference disappeared at 1 year, so after 1 year, there's no difference. Then 2 of the interesting studies, Harvard hospitals, Mass General, found significant problems, statistically significant increases in incontinence, bowel dysfunction, and erectile dysfunction at 3 months, 12 months, and greater than 2 years out from treatment with protons over photons. The largest retrospective study that's been done is based on SEER Medicare claims data, published in JAMA, big journal, 2012, showed that IMRT photons, in what's normally used, had significantly lower diarrhea, loose stool, than protons did, which is kind of wild. No difference in urinary side effects, sexual dysfunction, hip fracture, additional therapies. The thought is that maybe we just haven't quite figured out protons yet. But yeah, that Bragg peak looks real, but we're not quite sure right where it's falling, and if it falls in the wrong place, that can lead to problems. That's actually why all proton centers are still just treating with two beams. It's something called range uncertainty, meaning you're not quite sure how far that range of that beam and that back peak is stopping. So they stop, treat from the sides with protons in case they miss, get a lecture dose here, a little lecture dose here, not as consequential. It's out here in the bones and the muscle, which is less consequential. If you miss with that brag peak coming from the front and the back, and you drop that brag peak excessively in the rectum, watch out. It's not a good situation. I think I'll stop there actually for now. So I think I've gone over my time. I just have a few slides on immunotherapy and metastatic disease, but I think it's probably best to stop there and take any questions that you have.
Has anybody got a question? We can go this way. Yeah, look, you show it, ladies, wherever.
Did you want to make sure?
How do you get patients to lay so still?
Whips and chains, basically. No, that's a really good question. So we have a mobilization devices when a patient comes in. It depends upon what part of the body we're treating. So, for example, if we're treating above kind of the middle of the lung, we make a mask for patients. So if I'm treating, say, a cancer in someone's throat, or a cancer in someone's tongue, or a brain tumor, we'll make them this mask called an aquaplast mask. It looks like a big yellow net. It has holes in it. You can see through it. You can breathe through it. And it's kind of this really nice plastic material, basically. We put it in a warm oven. It softens, goes super soft and stretchy. We stretch that over the patient's face and neck. Forms perfectly to the shape of them. Looks like a stretched out mold of them. And it has little clips that kind of clip into these little holes in that rigid carbon fiber tabletop. And so that every time when they come in for treatment, they can lay there and put this mask that they can see through, breathe through, talk through, but it fits over them. It's rigid at that point because it's room temperature and basically locks them in, keeps them in basically precise, perfect position. And it has little marks on it. We line those little marks and dots up to those laser-guided leveling and gridding systems. For lower body stuff, we typically use something called a back bag, or Aquaplast makes products, but essentially think of a big blue bean bag with an air port on the side. We'll essentially put that big blue bean bag under the patient's buttocks or legs or thighs, mold it to the shape of them, and then suck the air out, basically making a mold or a cast of their lower body that they can slide into perfectly every time. That's a really good question. Yeah, another good question. So this one says, does the type of breast cancer respond similarly to radiation therapy? Triple negative versus ER positive, etc. So yeah, in general, it's kind of a funny concept, but in general, more rapidly dividing, more aggressive or sinister cancers actually respond better to radiation. The reason is, remember the mechanism of action of radiation, where I put up the pictures of DNA and how we're getting in there with either direct damage that's just breaking the DNA itself, or indirect damage that's causing an oxidant, and that breaks the DNA. It's all about exposure of DNA. And when a cell is dividing, in order to replicate itself, divide and split from 1 into 2 and 2 into 4, it has to basically condense its DNA and basically give us a target. And so oftentimes I'll see tumors with a very high replicative rate, like a triple negative breast cancer metastasis, for example, or small cell lung cancer. We'll treat them and they'll just absolutely shrink. Those are the ones that oftentimes we see almost evaporate by the end of treatment. And sometimes it's those slower growing, more indolent tumors that have that slower, more prolonged response. The weird kind of, deal to that is overall though, it's easy to shrink one tumor, but those tumors like the triple negative breast cancers or the small cell lung cancers, because they're more biologically aggressive, divide more quickly, they're more likely to then pop up somewhere else in the body because of their aggressive nature, which is why most of those tumors we're also using chemotherapy for, to infuse in the bloodstream and chase them everywhere.
So my understanding is that once you've had a cancer, your chances of getting another cancer go up. Would this radiation
so there is a risk of secondary malignancies with radiation, basically. So what you often see in a general population is that overall patients who have had cancer of any type, irrespective of their treatment, whether they got chemo, surgery, or radiation, they are kind of maybe a little bit more likely, depends on the cancer, but are more likely to grow another one in the future. And that's one issue. And that's probably because of some baseline genetic disturbance in their normal stem cells. But what you're getting at is an important concept. That's the risk of secondary malignancies because of radiation. So there is a very small risk, a tiny risk, but a real one. When the radiation beam comes in there and breaks the DNA, like I showed you in its mechanism of action, the cell comes in, lays down, new asphalt, new DNA, fixes that break like it should, but makes a little mistake. Makes a little mistake that's not caught. And one day, many years out from radiation treatment, it causes a new cancer. So that is a side effect. I've seen it happen. It happens super rarely. Taking all radiation patients as a huge group, it's less than 1%, but I've seen it's devastating when it happens. Patient getting treated for breast cancer, 10 years later she develops a sarcoma. By definition, that's a radiation-induced malignancy because it's at the exact same site as the radiation. Remember, radiation is super local. So if a woman gets, breast cancer and then develops lymphoma in her opposite side armpit, or gets a sarcoma in her buttock, or cervical cancer, those are not radiation-induced. But if she develops skin cancer or sarcoma on that breast, that was us. That was radiation treatment. And that's a super rare event, but it's absolutely devastating when it happens. Because our job, right, I built my whole career on curing cancer, and when your therapy causes one, it's heartbreaking for sure. We see it more for sure, and time is a big, so time and dose are the two big risk factors there. And volume, so you want to radiate as small of an area as you can to as low of a dose as possible, which is why I love those hypofractionation studies where we're using fewer treatments to achieve equivalent cure rates, because we're also, by the way, decreasing the risk of secondary malignancies for those folks based upon radiobiology, because we're being tighter, more conformal, we're using fewer treatments. The other thing, you see it much more in people who have a ton more time to live. So for example, where a lot of our data on secondary malignancies comes from is in children. So kids less than 10 have actually a pretty substantial risk of a secondary malignancy from chemo. Chemo causes secondary malignancies, as well as radiation. Pretty high in that population, compared to a lot of patients, say, with prostate cancer, guys in their 60s and 70s. Honestly, just based on their natural lifespan, will never live long enough to really make that anywhere near a meaningful risk. But it's certainly one everyone should know about before they sign up for radiation treatment.
Can you, with radiotherapy, treat melanoma that has found its way to the brain or to the heart or to other tissues like that that are critical?
You can. Melanoma is a really tough actor. So melanoma is resistant to all therapies. It's tough to get rid of surgically, and that's always our first option if we can cut it out and get around it. It's resistant to chemotherapies, and it's resistant to radiation, especially conventionally fractionated radiation. It's almost, in my opinion, a waste of time to do like little tiny 1.8 grade chunks or 2.0 grade chunks. Melanoma almost seems to laugh at conventionally delivered fractionated radiotherapy. What does work really well, though, and kind of overcomes that inherent radio resistance are those newer therapies I talked about. Stereotactic body radiation therapy, stereotactic radiosurgery. So I treat a lot of brain metastases. Melanoma commonly metastasizes to the brain. And we'll use stereotactic ablative radiation to treat several lesions within the brain. Get very, very good local control. The heart is a different one. Now, that's a funny place for a lesion to go. Melanoma, doesn't surprise me that you mentioned heart melanoma, though, because melanoma is just a weird, bad actor. And I have seen melanoma, go to the heart. It's kind of a strange thing, but the hard thing about the heart is it's beating, it's moving all the time. So it's incredibly difficult to focus and zap one particular part when it's always kind of shifting and bouncing around. But lymph nodes, lung mets, bone mets from melanoma, all are fair game, and brain mets are controlled actually pretty well, as long as you're using a really hot dose, focus super tight just on the lesion itself. You get some pretty good local control. Says questions aren't recorded. Can you repeat that? Gotcha. Oh, that's right, because I have a separate mic for the video.
What's the cost of therapy?
Yeah, so cost, like most things in medicine, is pretty expensive. But it's actually really, so it depends on how you look at it, but it's actually really cost effective compared to a lot of other treatments. So, for example, cost is also a moving target in medicine, which is one thing I absolutely hate about medicine. You can't go to any one source, there's no menu you can read off of that says, hey, how much does a course of radiation for breast cancer cost? How much does a course of radiation for prostate cancer cost? How much does stereotactic radiation for brain met, melanoma? You know, it's different depending upon the patient's insurance, where they get treated, who treats them, the different bells and whistles that you use. But essentially one thing I can tell you is, one, radiation treatment is kind of, basically the more treatments you give, the more expensive it is for society as a whole, whether it's insurance or the patient, which is one reason I really love these hypofractionation studies. Basically doing the same work in fewer treatments. It's more cost effective. Basically, a very important concept in oncology care right now is value. It's essentially bang for your buck. So it's treatment efficacy on the top and cost of treatment. So you want the value, the efficacy to be really high, you want the cost to be really low. So it's no surprise that those two breast cancer trials that basically paved the way for us going from 25 to 15 or 16 treatments were basically investigated and published in two countries who, no surprise, are actually incentivized to do less to people from a financial standpoint, that being the UK and Canada. Now also, radiation treatment, while it is expensive, is actually a lot less expensive than some of the other things. So for example, there's a drug called erythropoietin. You might know it because I think Lance Armstrong used it to win multiple Tours de France, amongst other various things. But it's given to patients who are basically, anemic and need to basically produce more red blood cells. And there's a really good statistic that basically, I think it was just about 5 years ago, the Centers for Medicaid Services, so Medicare basically, spent like way more on that single drug on EPO than they did on all radiation for all Medicare cancer patients across the entire country. So it kind of puts it in perspective, but cost is something that you certainly have to think about no matter what. Okay, I think that's all of them.
Further questions?